Hey yo, jeez, the king is dead. Glory to the kingdom, the king is dead. Robert Mugabe, teacher, guerrilla, political prisoner, father of Zimbabwe, prime minister turned president turned despot leader turned exiled leader, has finally perished at the grand old age of 95. Whether it was a good one or a bad one, nobody can say that he didn't leave his mark on the world before he ultimately departed from it. And despite what a lot of the international press would lead you to believe, his story, his reign is complicated. So let's go deep, let's really get into the history of it all and try to make sense of the Zimbabwe that you see today. Zimbabwe, in one form or another, has existed as a country for over 1,000 years. But today, much of what you see throughout the country is the legacy of colonialism, and a harsh, bloody and callous legacy it is. The story of modern Zimbabwe is but another sibling in the Southern African family, where the mother is the high school sweetheart who everybody wanted to get with, but was either too shy to make any serious moves or lacked the game or swag to do so even if they made an attempt. She was like the envy of the town, do you remember? Except now the party's over. It's been nearly 20 years, she ran into the wrong crowd, got a bunch of kids, and is now stuck with the abusive stepfather who likes to whip the kids, and her of course, over the back of the head with his Sunday shoes and put out those nasty ghastly cigarettes on their foreheads whenever he has a bad day at work. That abusive stepfather, his name was Cecil John Rhodes. You heard that right. That Rhodes of the Rhodes Scholarship, Rhodes Must Fall, and of Rhodesia fame. Half man, half monster. He accomplished quite the fantastical feats in his short life. So raw, rugged and ruthless in his pursuit for riches and unbridled power. He typified the business magnate of the Victorian age. And it was at the close of the 19th century, in the thick of the scramble for Africa, that Kid Zimbabwe fell into the palms of Rhodes. Through the British South Africa Company, he founded Rhodesia, a territory which consisted of modern-day Zimbabwe and Zambia. And from here on out, he wasted no time in wresting away control and access away from the native population. Through a series of wars, taxes and legislative measures, local Zimbabweans were dispossessed of their lands and livelihoods and were forced to live under a brutal and cruel system of white supremacy. Within about 40 years, a time span shorter than Rhodes' own natural life, Zimbabwe, once the land of vast kingdoms, stone-walled cities and great miners, where until then, despite how hard they tried to convince us, saw no white man, in its people became the soar of the white man. The beauty of her diamond smile and golden glow captivated all who were so lucky to feast their eyes upon it, all the while reminding them of what they always wanted but couldn't always have. Cecil, much like the rest of his compadres, was in lust, but greed, insecurity and the want for total domination cut short every single shred of hope that love would eventually blossom out of this new relationship and family. By 1930, over half of the country's land, which was almost as large as the UK, was set aside for about 50,000 people, or approximately 5% of the population. Almost all of the best land could be found here, and every single one of those landowners in that land were white. Then, a paltry 22% of the country's land was left to the other 90% or more of the population, and hint hint, they were black. Life immediately took a nosedive for the native African population. People went from farming and working their own land with armies of livestock and livelihood of their own to living in overcrowded conditions where every disease under the glaring African sun ran rampant. Proud chiefs, warriors, expert hunters were reduced to wage servants who were forced to work in the harshest of conditions as their colonial masters plundered their resources and barely returned a shilling to the land, the soil that cultivated such exorbitant wealth for them in the first place. So, nobody could hardly be surprised when Zimbabweans started revolting. And this is where we get back to our friend Robert Mugabe. He answered the call to lead that revolt and fought for the liberation of his people by any means necessary. And he paid for this in hard time in prison. Over 10 years and a gazillion degrees later, Mugabe was out, and with the ZANU-PF party, eventually won liberation for Zimbabwe from white minority rule in 1980. But for anyone who really knows what's cracking deep down in the Zim, You can't have a meaningful conversation about the country post-white minority rule without talking about land reform. And in order to understand land reform in Zimbabwe, you need to have a strong command of the Lancaster House Agreement. There's no two ways about it. It took place in 1979 and essentially laid out the building blocks for the redistribution of land from the white minority to the black majority. This is the part that the BBC never tells you about. Everybody knew that this day was coming and formally agreed to it in principle. What happened in the late 2000s wasn't simply a random act of tyranny. It was the build-up of frustration, impatience, and the grinding poverty which had afflicted the country and equated to lots of political pressure. Back when the Lancaster House Agreement was made, around 40 years ago, which is coincidentally the same amount of time it took for the British to effectively take absolute control of the nation, the proceedings for transferring white political and economic rule of the country to the black majority began. And it started with the new Zimbabwean government offering to guarantee the payment of white civil servant pensions, protect their private property from land grabs, and buy back their land. Wait, huh? What? This is news, right? Yes, that was offered, and to a certain degree it actually happened. Under a willing buyer, willing seller clause, the Mugabe government, with the help of international donors, purchased over 2 million acres of land back from white landowners from the period of 1980 to 1990, at market prices, mind you. Now look at that. How often do you see a tyrannical and unreasonable government buy back land that was essentially stolen from them? But here's where it gets sticky. 2 million acres just wasn't going to cut it. Murmurs turned into jeers by the Zimbabwean public. Unemployment rose. Economic growth was outstripped by population growth and meant real wage declines for the population at large. So now, picture this. You are a white landowner in Zimbabwe. Let's just say that your name is Ian. You have almost all of the good land, and there's one big buyer scouting your gear out. Your government. You know that as time goes by and living standards continue to fall for the public because the majority of them barely have any land, and so any basis for wealth, loan collateral and general development, your main customer in the Zimbabwean government is going to become more cagey about potential revolts, coups and mass disturbances of any sort which may threaten to undermine the stability and place of the state and the governing party. The number one policy for delivery is land, and the longer it takes for the follow-up, the more desperate the state becomes. Let's be real here. If you're Ian, based on that info, what would you be doing when the Sim government comes to your door to talk about land? White landowners saw the point of leverage and exploited it and pushed up selling prices way beyond what could be considered reasonable, and therefore not enough land was reclaimed. For 10 years, the Mugabe government drained its coffers and goodwill trying to financially wrest back land and wealth from its former colonial masters as the public watched on, with increasingly idle hands and thinner paychecks. So could any of us have expected anything else when after nearly 20 years, Zimbabweans started saying enough and took the first steps of what was to become wide-scale land expropriation? Villagers and war veterans took matters into their own hands and began forcefully occupying white-owned land, with these episodes serving as the prelude to what was to become of a national program of land expropriation. Now, don't get us wrong, in execution, the government messed up with this policy in almost every manner conceivable. It was violent, botched, overly politicized, and effectively illegal on many fronts. But you have to also ask yourself, is radical structural change at any level pretty? Ever? When we talk about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Arab Spring, and so many others, do we stop to declare that violent action undermined it and thus outright invalidated the revolutionary effort? Is the US Civil War unjust and wrong because it had a violence rarely seen in that country until then? Better yet, why are wealthy, silver spoon revolutionary generals such as George Washington and Napoleon so highly revered and respected, in spite of their violent episodes and obvious character flaws, while the Haitian revolutionary that successfully led an army of slaves against one of these same generals towards their emancipation is viewed as massacre maestro extraordinaire? When the revolutionary fits the smug confines of Eurocentric sensibilities, it's, well, shit happens. But when they fall out of that scope, shit hits the fan. Now let's get to the aftermath of Zim's nationwide land expropriation program. Things didn't exactly work out as planned, because it's one thing to get the land, but it's a completely different thing when it comes to maintaining it. Mugabe ended up giving a lot of the land seized to his cronies in government and the military, perhaps as a way for him to cling on to power that bit longer. The problem was, these people weren't farmers. Many of them had no experience or expert understanding of what it took to ensure that a nation was fed well at all times. Harvest plummeted and food prices skyrocketed. High rates of inflation were beginning to creep in, and protests shortly followed. Civil servants in the military were not happy, to say the least. So, in response to this, the government opted to print more money in order to pay for wage increases and also to keep up with debt repayments. Big mistake. Enter hyperinflation. But before we move on, something that we need to be clear on. Zim printing money was not the primary cause of hyperinflation throughout the country. It was the drop in food and manufacturing output, which happened in response to poorly implemented land reform policies that did it. If it were not for that, the pressure the government received to placate portions of the public with wage increases would not have been. The printing of money exacerbated inflationary pressure. To lay all of the blame on money printing for Zimbabwe's inflationary woes is missing the point, and makes as much sense as somebody saying that water caused an oil fire in your kitchen. For those of you who do not know, water, when poured on oil that has been set on fire, ends up making the fire even worse. It doesn't help matters. But if we want to avoid another one of these fires, we need to figure out what caused the oil to be set on fire in the first place. It's really that simple. Printing money or increasing the money supply is not inherently wrong. If executed properly, it need not increase inflation significantly, as has been seen in countries and regions such as the USA, UK, Japan, and the Euro area, who engage or are engaging in something called quantitative easing, which is basically a fancy way of saying that you're going to print more money. After a couple years of hyperinflation, the country abandoned its national currency altogether and switched to using a foreign basket of currencies which included the US dollar and the rand when it came to carrying out transactions in Zimbabwe. Then, almost overnight, inflation figures dropped to low single digits and stayed that way for almost 10 years. And then, you never heard mention of Zimbabwe in the mainstream media until...
We wish to assure the nation that His Excellency the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe and Commander-in-Chief of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces, Comrade R.G. Mugabe, and his family are safe and sound, and their security is guaranteed. We are only targeting criminals around him who are committing crimes that are causing social and economic suffering in the country in order to bring them to justice. As soon as we have accomplished our mission, we expect that the situation will return to normalcy. We wish to make it abundantly clear that this is not a military takeover of government.
Since then, Zimbabwe got a new president. Former white Zimbabwean farmers are being invited back into the country, this time on terms more favourable to the natives though. Runaway inflation is rearing its ugly head back into the nation, and they've gone back to using a national currency of their own in the form of Zimbabwean dollars. This move I actually agree with. The adoption of foreign currencies such as the USD to settle national transactions was always meant to be temporary. While adopting another nation's currency can guarantee a certain level of stability in testing times, it can also trap your economy and have you beholden to a currency whose exchange rate value doesn't always accurately reflect the situation on the ground where you are. We only need to look at the Euro area to see this. The member states such as Greece are still struggling to recover from their economic woes, and for better or worse, you can't print money at will when it's someone else's currency. Now look, he eventually messed up real bad, but one way or another, land redistribution had to occur, and how apt it is that it is the land that best encapsulates Zim's fight for something more. Because many things can happen to land. It can get run down, wiped clean of all plants, fauna, attachments and fixtures and all, but it is still land which can be of use, Some way, somehow, it can be repurposed. Though, the only way to figure that out is to have the land in the first place. Sometimes a clean slate is necessary if you ever want to build anything of your own. And to the people out there that say, look at Zimbabwe now as a result of these land reform policies, look at where it is a mess. I would implore you to give the country time. You have to bear in mind it's only really been about 10 or 15 years since they started implementing these policies and figuring out how to manage their country in this new setting. I don't know, perhaps I can pose it in a different way. How about 20 years after the American Revolution happened and the founding of the country occurred with 1776? So let's take it to 1796. What was America like then? Was it the America you see today? Was it as powerful, as dynamic, and as rich as the America of today? I'm sure it wasn't. From what I can remember, America back in 1796 was still one of the little ones on the come up, but still experiencing a lot of instability, a lot of infighting. Things weren't perfect. It was the first 20 years. I would say give Zimbabwe time. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've got anything that you'd like to add or contest, drop a line in the comment section. There was a good article that I'd encourage you to read to get a better idea of Zimbabwe and its history surrounding land reform. I'll leave it in the description box. And yeah, until next time, thank you for listening, and yeah, nice.